Hello everyone and welcome to a new video. Today I'll be making a luscious green velvet robe, complete with a dramatic hood and a heavily gathered skirt. This project was designed to be paired with my holiday costume from this year, which is a 1630 satin gown. However, this garment definitely has more of a fantasy element as opposed to being rooted in history, but even though it wasn't designed with historical accuracy in mind, I think it has a historic flair to it as well, and it complements my 17th century gown nicely, in addition to being a lovely piece in itself. I had a very specific vision of a garment where the collar turned into a hood, and this seemed like the right season to make that a reality. So I did, and I'm excited to share the process of constructing it with all of you, and I hope you enjoy seeing it come together. Step 1 was pinning my pattern to the floral velvet mesh that will make up this project. It was a Christmas release from Joanns that I fell in love with and bought all of. The material actually inspired this project. I saw it and knew it needed to be a dramatic cloak or robe of some sort. This pattern was self-drafted by me and is pretty simple. The bodice consists of two pieces. The body of it is cut once from velvet and once from lining, and the second piece, which is the lapel/collar, is cut twice from the velvet. The hood is also two pattern pieces, but they are each cut twice from the velvet and twice from the lining. The hood is the result of a half dozen different mock-ups and many major pattern alterations, but I finally came up with something I was happy with. The hood actually started out as almost a rectangle, shaped with gathering. Then I decided that was too bulky, so it became a rectangle with darts taking in one edge. But I didn't have enough shape, so I removed the darts and added a seam to create more of a bell shape. And then I took it in by about 6 inches. And here we are with a final hood pattern. And in addition to the rounded shapes that make up the hood, I also cut out a 5-inch by 40-inch strip that will form the brim or band that goes around the front. After my bodice and hood were cut from the velvet, I pinned the pieces to my lining fabric, which is another find from Joanns, though this has been in my stash for a few years. And I cut the bodice and hood patterns out once again. The collar is the most labor-intensive part of this project, so I'm making it first, and step 1 is using a ruler to mark a line ½ inch away from each edge on the wrong side of the fabric using chalk. Then I'm tracing my collar pattern onto hair canvas, which is a canvas used for stabilizing collars and lapels when tailoring. This canvas is quite voluminous and heavy, so it shouldn't extend into the seam allowance of the lapel, so I'm marking a ½ inch inside the edges of the collar, then cutting along that line. The hair canvas is pinned to the wrong side of the collar with a ½ inch of the velvet fabric extending beyond each edge. In some cases, it's more like a 1/4 inch than a ½ inch because I wasn't as precise as I should have been when cutting out the velvet layer. If I had been, then the chalk markings on the velvet would have been a perfect guide for helping me line up the canvas properly. Then I'm cross-stitching around all of the edges of the hair canvas. And now, following the grain of the hair canvas, I'm pad stitching the canvas to the velvet. Pad stitching is the method of securing layers of material together. It's done using whip stitches going in opposite directions, and the denser the stitches are, the more support it provides to the fabric. The stitches just catch a few threads from the outer fabric and shouldn't be visible from the exterior. Though this process stiffens the outer fabric, it retains its flexibility, which allows it to be steamed into different shapes. That's why it's used so frequently in tailoring. The alternative to this is using some sort of interfacing, but I prefer the effect of the canvas, and I find this whole process kind of satisfying, and it's good for me to get some practice at it. When that's done, I'm whip stitching bias cut cotton tape around the edges of the canvas. This motivates the fabric to turn inward at that point, leading to a sharper looking collar. Probably not necessary in this case, but as I said, it's honestly kind of fun. I'll link where I purchased these tapes down below. You can also use bias binding, but I like the tapes better because they're thinner and the edges are pre-finished instead of being folded to finish. Now I'm ironing the fabric to smooth out any tension my stitches may have put on the material. Though this fabric is velvet, I found I was able to iron it as long as I was ironing the wrong side and not using a super high heat. While I was at the ironing board, I also folded the seam allowance from the outer edges of the collar inward, so they wrap over the edge of the hair canvas. Then I'm whip stitching those edges in place, securing them to the canvas. That's all that can be done with the collar for now, so it's on to the bodice. After removing the pattern paper, I pinned the darts into the front of the bodice and the bodice lining. These are open darts, so instead of having to mark the dart placement on the fabric, I just had to pin the edges together and then stitch them with a ½ inch allowance. The darts were then sewn by machine, and while I was at it, I also sewed up the shoulder seams using a ½ inch seam allowance. Now both the darts and the shoulder seams were thoroughly ironed, or as thoroughly as you can iron polyester satin and velvet. I cut a notch into the fronts of the bodice pieces when cutting them out. This marks where the lapel begins, and speaking of the lapels, sewing them on is the next step. The unreinforced lapel is sewn to the lining layer of the bodice with the right sides facing each other, and the reinforced and partially finished lapel is pinned to the velvet layer of the bodice with the right sides facing each other. I sewed the lapel on, carefully following the edge of the tape that was sewn to the inner edge of the lapel. And for the lining layer that wasn't reinforced, I used a standard 1/2-inch seam allowance. Then I folded the seam allowance under the lining and top stitched it down. Usually this would be done with edge stitching, where you sew as close to the edge of the material as you possibly can, but I stitched about 1/4 inch away from the edge instead, so it would be more likely to be hidden when the lapel was turned outward. Now the lapels were ironed, and in the case of the lining layer, I ironed the seam allowance to one side. For the outer layer, I ironed the seam open. Now before doing anything exciting, I'm stitching 1/2 inch away from the edges of the arm side, or armhole of the bodice. I'm doing this to create a guide for where the edges will turn inward later on, so it's repeated with the lining layer as well. Now I'm setting the lining aside and focusing on the outer layer arm side. To get the edge to turn inward more smoothly, I'm clipping into the seam allowance, just shy of the stitching 1/2 inch away from the edge. Then I'm using my fingers to ease the seam allowance inward along the line of stitching. As I fold it inward, I'm also whip stitching it down. You could just use basting stitches for this, since the edge will be further secured later on, but they are almost the same amount of effort, so I just used whip stitches. Then I'm laying the lining on top of the outer layer of fabric with the right sides facing each other, and pinning around the front and bottom edges. Then I'm sewing across the edges, and there was a 1 inch allowance at the front and a 1/2 inch allowance at the bottom, and I marked the points that need to be sewn with chalk, then just followed those lines. Now I'm clipping excess material from the corners, and just trimming the seam allowance down in general. Now the bodice can be turned so the right sides are facing outward. Then I went ahead and pinned around the edges I just sewed the lining to, and made sure the lining was even with the outer fabric so it isn't visible from the exterior of the garment. Then I pinned the layers together just beyond the inner edge of the collar, and I'm using my fingers to feel the seam allowance from the lapel, then placing the pins just past that point. I'm also turning the outer edge of the lapel lining inward so it sits just inside the already finished edge of the outer lapel layer, but I'm only doing this for the bottom third or so of the lapels on each side. The rest is left free so I can attach the hood later on. I'm using loose whip stitches to secure the lining to the outer layer of fabric. These stitches run across the points I'd already pinned, so around the bottom and front edges of the bodice and just inside the inner edge of the collar. These stitches won't have much, if any, strain on them, so I'm making them quite large, and they are mostly going through the lining, only catching a few threads from the outer layer of fabric, so they won't be visible from the exterior of the garment. I also pinned the layers together around the armhole, and now I'm clipping into the lining seam allowance so I can turn the edge inward smoothly on the stitch line I sewed earlier that's 1/2 inch away from the edge. Which is what you see me doing here. I did this because I wanted the armholes to be as large as possible to make it easier to fit them over the large sleeves from the dress worn underneath this, which is why I'm turning the seam allowance inward instead of binding it after sewing the sleeves on. It gives just enough extra room to make a big difference. Now I'm slip stitching the lining to the outer layer of the fabric around this edge. And I was actually using a balsa hat block to support the fabric while doing this, totally not its intended purpose, but one it is quite good at. And now we can move on to the hood. The first step, after removing the hood piece from the pattern, is pinning darts into each piece. These darts provide shape to the back of the hood without me having to piece it together. There are 2 darts in each piece, and 2 pieces make up the outer layer of the hood, and 2 pieces make up the lining of the hood, and they all need the darts. So they all got the darts, and after pinning them, they were sewn and the pieces were ironed. Now the newly darted hood pieces are pinned together down what is the center back edge. The lining pieces are pinned and sewn together with the right sides facing each other, as are the velvet pieces. And then there's more ironing. There's always more ironing. I'm removing the panels that make up the lower portion of the hood from the pattern and pinning them together at the center back edges. This edge was stitched, then the seam allowance was ironed open. I lined up the center back seams, and then the outer edge of the lower hood piece was pinned to the bottom edge of the upper hood piece, and I'm pinning outward from the center back seam and easing both edges together since they are slightly rounded. This was done with both the lining and the velvet layers of the fabric. Then the pieces were stitched together with a 1/2 inch allowance, and you guessed it, the seam allowance was ironed. Now I'm pinning the lining to the velvet layer of the hood with the wrong sides together. You want the right sides facing outward for once. And I'm pinning the pieces together at the bottom edge. The pieces are sewn together at this edge too, a ½ inch away from the edge to be exact. This stitching will be used as a guide later on. Now I'm pinning around the front edge of the hood, once again making sure that the center back seams line up and pinning outward from that point. And now it's time to reinforce the brim of the hood, because I want it to be quite dramatic and hold itself open around my face. And for this I'm using 3 strips of the stiff cotton interfacing called band roll. This is traditionally used to reinforce waistbands and prevent them from rolling. It comes in lots of widths and in fabric that can be purchased by the yard, but mine is pre-cut to 1 3/4 inch wide. As I said, I cut 3 strips of this, which were all the same length, and that length was slightly longer than the outer edge at the front of the hood. With everything cut, I used my fingers to fold 2 of the strips in half lengthwise. Then I'm pinning the folded strips so they encase the edges of the flat strip. This is to make the edges the stiffest points, and also to form a boning channel to reinforce it further. Well, this is actually when I formed the boning channel, simply by stitching ½ inch away from the edges of the strip on both sides of the strip. Since the velvet I'm using is applied to mesh, it has gaps in it. I didn't want any of the white band roll to show through the velvet, so I roughly cut a strip of lining to cover it. And this was pinned and sewn on in a similarly rough, imprecise manner, since it won't show at all in the end. Now I'm marking a line ½ inch away from the front edge of the hood on the right side of the hood. Then I'm pinning my interface band to the front edge of the hood so its edge is even with the marked line. And I trimmed off most of the excess too. Then I sewed on the band, and I'm stitching it on as close to the outer edge of the band as I possibly can, because I don't want to take away very much width from the boning channel I sewed into it earlier. Now I'm taking the long rectangle of velvet I cut out earlier and placing it over top of the hood with the right sides facing each other. I'm pinning one edge of the velvet strip so a little more than ½ an inch flaps over the band. Then it's sewn on, and I'm making sure that these stitches are just beyond the band roll stiffening band. It's pretty easy to do this just by feel because the band roll is really thick, so the foot doesn't naturally want to move on top of it or sew over it, but you could mark the stitch point if you're worried. To avoid any visible top stitching, I sewed the velvet band to the lining of the hood by hand using everyone's favorite stitch, or at least my favorite stitch, the whip stitch. That would be a good drinking game for my videos. Take a drink every time I whip stitch something. And by good, I mean a way to quickly become intoxicated, which is not good, so don't do that. And if anyone asks, I did not tell or encourage you to do that, and I'm not responsible for any harm that comes to you. Anyway, I'm adding boning to the hood and the pockets created by stitching the folded band roll to the edges of the not folded band roll. This is plain old plastic boning that I will link down below, but you could also use featherweight boning, which is sold in Joanns, zip ties, or plastic strapping. Now the hood is pinned to the interior of the collar, and I notched the fabric where the hood is meant to begin, so it's easy to position. Or it was supposed to be. The bottom edge of the hood was slightly too wide. I think it warped when sewing, so I had to add a tiny 1 inch pleat to the center back, but it's barely noticeable. Also, the line of stitching ½ an inch away from the bottom edge of the hood, which we sewed earlier, is aligned with the outer edge of the collar to ensure it's evenly placed. The hood was first whip stitched to the interior of the collar, and these stitches are just going through the canvas inner lining, so they aren't visible from the outside of the collar. Then I flipped the bodice over and stitched the hood on more securely to the outer edge of the collar using tiny little slip stitches. Now the loose portion of the collar lining can be turned inward by ½ inch and pinned over top of the raw edges of the hood. And the collar lining was secured in place with more tiny slip stitches. And once again, I'm using my handy, or heady, hat block to support the curved edges while hand sewing. I think this will make a lot of appearances in future videos, which means we should name it. I'm open to suggestions. Okay, now onto the sleeves. I didn't actually have these drafted until after finishing the bodice construction, which is why they weren't cut out at the beginning, but I'm cutting them out now. The sleeves are actually split sleeves left open in the center to reveal the sleeves of the dress worn underneath it, as seen in some 17th century paintings. Instead of constructing a sleeve and then slashing the center, I'm leaving it open at the center from the beginning. And I'm taking advantage of the intricate borders of the velvet fabric by carefully trimming away the excess mesh and just leaving the lacy edge. Since the velvet is cut and stitched to the mesh, I'm not cutting through the velvet in this process, just trimming the mesh, so this edge will not fray. Also, due to lack of fabric, the sleeve pieces were all cut one at a time to give me more options when arranging them, so this was repeated 4 times. And the front and back sleeve panels looked remarkably similar, so I used labeled sticky notes pinned to the fabric to mark the front side. Then I pinned the front and back sleeve pieces together with the right sides facing each other. The underarm seam was then sewn, and this was sewn with a 1-inch allowance since I had plans to finish it nicely. But any finishing method would have made it more bulky, and this fabric doesn't really fray, so I didn't bother. By eye, I turned the bottom edge of the sleeve inward by approximately 1/4 inch and stitched it down. Then I used a ruler and chalk to mark a line 1.5 inches away from the bottom edge of the sleeve. The fabric was folded up to meet that line and sewn down. This creates a 3/4 inch wide channel, which will be threaded with ribbon and used to gather down the bottom edge of the sleeve. I like the adjustability of the sleeves having a drawstring, especially since they'll be worn over another garment, and allows the fit to be altered to allow for the bulkiness of whatever is underneath it. The top edge, however, needs to fit into the armhole, so it has to be gathered to a specific length, which is 26 inches. If you sew, you'll probably know that that is a really big freaking armhole. I think the arm size for a recent 18th century project of mine was a mere 19 inches. But as we have already established, the armhole has to be large to fit over the large sleeves of the dress worn underneath it. I'm gathering this down by hand using running stitches pulled taut, and I'm gathering each side of the sleeve down to 13 inches. Then tying off my thread. This helps keep the gathering more even. The gathers were adjusted until I felt they were evenly distributed, then I bound the edge with twill tape, which was top stitched on by machine. I really regret doing this because it looks so harsh against the dark green lining of the bodice. Even though it's technically a tidy finish, it just looks horribly out of place. I should have made coordinating binding out of the lining fabric and used that instead. I'm about 90% sure I'm going to remove the sleeves and redo this because I'm so bothered, and as someone who hates sleeves and hates altering finished costumes, that means a lot. Since the armholes were already finished, instead of seaming the sleeves to them, I pinned them so the edge of the armhole lined up with the gathering point on the sleeves. I also made sure the open edge of the sleeves were lined with the shoulder seam of the bodice. Then the sleeves could be stitched on by hand using tiny slip stitches, and lots of them, because I wanted these to be durable. With one of my first historical costumes, I had a sleeve fall off while I was photographing it because my sewing abilities were that poor. And now I'm paranoid that will happen again when hand stitching sleeves on, so I'm extra thorough and use extra stitches. I used ribbon threaded through a bobby pin, which was threaded through the channel at the bottom of the sleeves to add the drawstring to them. Though full disclosure, I later removed this, cut 1 inch off the bottom of both sleeves, and re-sewed the channel because they were too long. But I didn't film that because it was the exact same process you saw earlier, just with slightly shorter sleeve pieces. So now I could do a fitting, and the bodice was too short-waisted. When I was fitting my mock-up, I forgot to trim the seam allowance from the hem of the bodice, so I'd expected the garment to be a 1/2 inch longer in the waist than it actually was. But this was an easy fix. I simply cut a piece of cotton tape that was 2 inches longer than the bottom edge of the bodice. Then I marked a line 1/2 inch away from one edge. Then I completely ignored that line and sewed the tape to the bodice with the wrong sides facing each other and a 1/4 inch seam allowance, making sure 1 inch of cotton extended past the edge of the bodice on each side. From the right side of the bodice, I top stitched the seam allowance at the hem down, further securing it to the tape. This extended the waist of the bodice by a full inch, even when including the seam allowance to secure the skirt. Speaking of the skirt, it was made from 3 56-inch long panels of velvet that were the full width of the material. The panels will be sewn together with a 1 inch allowance, edge to edge, but before doing that I trimmed off the majority of the mesh that extends past the edge of the velvet. Then the pieces were seamed together, and I paid attention to the nap of the fabric when doing this, because the sheen of the velvet is slightly different depending on what direction you look at it from. So I wanted all the panels to be going in the same direction so it would be consistent across the skirt. I didn't have the luxury of doing this with the sleeves due to lack of fabric, but in this case I could pay attention to it, so I did. I decided that once again I would take advantage of the lacy velvet edges of the fabric at the center front of the robe, so I carefully trimmed the front edges of the skirt panels. Now, like I did for the sleeves, I'm turning the bottom edge of the skirt inward by 1/4 third-ish of an inch by eye and sewing it down. Then I'm marking a line 8 inches away from the skirt, all the way across the skirt, using chalk. The fabric is turned up to meet that line, then pinned in place. The hem was secured with cross stitches. I'll link an old tutorial about this process down below along with the diagram. It consists of staggered running stitches going in the same direction to create a cross effect. The stitches through the outer layer of fabric are very small, making it almost invisible from the exterior of the garment. The downside is that this takes a lot more thread than some other hemming stitches, but I find it weirdly fun, too. Now I'm gathering the top edge of the skirt down using the same method I showed earlier, of running stitches pulled taut to gather the material. I'm gathering each panel down to 9 inches, then tying off my thread to keep the gathering more even. Then the skirt was sewn to the cotton tape at the bottom of the bodice with a 1/2 inch allowance and the wrong sides facing each other. You want all the raw edges to be facing outward. They'll be covered by a waistband later on. But first I'm trimming the seam allowance from the skirt down to about a 1/4 inch, so there will be as little bulk as possible in the waistline. To make the waistband, I cut a 30-inch long strip of band roll in a narrower width and covered it with a rectangle of velvet that was secured in place by machine stitches 1/2 inch away from each edge. The beading will cover these stitches. Did I mention the beading? I feel like I should have mentioned the beading. There had to be beading. I'm using 6mm glass pearls, 12mm glass pearls, 12mm glass monties, and oval monties glued into brass frames. And I will link where I purchased these from down below. The beading pattern for the belt is done in 2 stages. The first is securing the frames and the centermost beads. The frames are placed vertically on the belt and secured with thread on either side. Then the 12mm glass monty is sewn on in the center of the belt, next to the frame. Monties are faceted glass beads and metal settings with holes in them that allow them to be stitched onto a garment, which is what I'm doing here. Then a 12mm pearl is sewn on, followed by another monty. Another frame is sewn on, and the pattern repeats. I came up with this pattern based on the jewels and beads I had remaining from my 1630s gown, which featured similar work on it, along with the colors and the clasps that will close the robe. The clasps are silver, and I want that to be incorporated into the beading too. Even though the frames are brass, I think the clear monties really tie it all together. After the frames and centermost beads were stitched on, I went through with 6mm pearls. These are stitched above and below the monties, then above and below either side of the 12mm pearls. This is really easy to do and makes the pattern appear much denser and more elaborate. Also, don't mind my bandaged cuticles. 'Tis the season for gross cracked skin, which was especially problematic when working on my very white 1630s gown. I think the paranoia of getting blood on that has taken a few years off my life. Off camera, I sewed 2 hooks and eyes into the belt, but over the bulk of the dress beneath it, the cape wouldn't fully close at the waist. So last minute, I replaced them with ties made from tubes of velvet and sewed to the underside of the belt, which add a really nice dramatic flair to the robe, which I love. So I think it was a happy accident that it didn't fit without them. I just wish I had time to film it. When the belt was fully beaded, I trimmed the ends so 1/2 inch of unembellished fabric extended past the beading. These ends were turned inward, as were the ends of the cotton tape that extended past the edge of the bodice. Then the belt was pinned to the robe. The belt is wide enough to cover the bottom of the bodice, the raw edge of the skirt, and the cotton tape between them. The belt was sewn on by hand using whip stitches, and due to the texture of the fabric, it blends in perfectly. The base of the belt disappears into the bodice fabric, and it looks like the beads were attached directly to the bodice instead of a separate piece that was later stitched on. Now the clasps could be sewn on, and they were spaced 2 inches apart on either side of the center front edges of the robe. I got these from Joanns, and weirdly the loops to secure them to the fabric were under the clasp, making them almost impossible to stitch on. Seriously, they are pretty, but whoever designed these did not consider how they would actually be worked with. In addition to stitching through the loops, I also had to stitch through the filigree pattern to further secure them. Then I sewed a 6mm pearl to either side and an 8mm pearl above it to help it blend in with the beading at the waist and make them look more dramatic. The robe is designed in such a way that it can be worn open, simply tied at the waist with the lapels flat, or clasped shut, which means I was very careful that none of my stitches went through the other side of the fabric, since then they could be seen when it was worn. The knots from my thread were carefully hidden under the pearls and clasps, with the end of the threads buried. Since the clasps were so weirdly made, it took almost 2 hours to sew a 1/2 dozen onto each side of the bodice. It was by far the most annoying part of making this. But it was also the last part of making this, so once it was done, I could appreciate my finished garment. Which I've done a lot of, because I think it looks pretty great. It's so dramatic and even better than I'd envisioned. I thought I'd prefer how it looks open, with the lapels out and the dress beneath it on show. But I love how it looks buttoned up, so just the necklace it's paired with is visible. Unfortunately, I didn't get too many photos with the hood up, but I love it too. The shape turned out wonderfully, dramatic but not overwhelming. It was worth the many mock-ups. I think this is the perfect robe to wear in a magical forest on a crisp winter day. I haven't had the opportunity to do that just yet, but I think it looked quite nice in our local Christmas tree farm too. And it was definitely a crisp winter day of about 20 degrees Fahrenheit. My hands were cold, but my spirit was warm since I was wearing something so pretty. That is it for this video. I will have links to relevant items in the description box, along with where more photos can be viewed, and the video about making the dress that went underneath this. If you enjoyed this, then giving this video a like and a comment really helps me out. And if you'd like to support my projects and get access to exclusive content, then my Patreon will be linked down below as well. You guys make projects and videos like this one possible, and I appreciate it so much. So thanks a bunch for watching. I hope you have a wonderful holiday, and I will talk to all of you very soon.